In medieval Europe, running away from a battle wasn't seen as a small mistake or just panic. In many armies, it could be treated as a serious crime, sometimes even as betrayal, because one person breaking ranks could trigger a full collapse. And even when a man survived the battlefield, the danger didn't always stop there. He could lose pay, be punished by his own commanders, or return home carrying a reputation that followed him for years. In this video, we're going to look at what actually happened to soldiers who fled, what the rules said, what commanders really did in practice, why the chase after a broken army was so deadly, and how the outcome depended on one big factor. Were you a knight with status, or an ordinary foot soldier who could be replaced? Number 1. What running away meant. In medieval Europe, running could mean a few different things. Skipping the muster, the official roll call, slipping out of camp at night, leaving your captain without permission, dropping out of the line during the fight, or riding or walking home the moment things looked bad. Those acts weren't equal in the eyes of medieval commanders. A man who failed to show up might be punished through his village, his lord, or local courts. A man who broke ranks in the middle of combat could be treated as a direct danger to everyone around him, because fear spreads fast. And a man who vanished after a defeat might be hunted like a criminal or quietly melt back into civilian life if no one could prove anything. It also matters what kind of army he was in. Medieval forces weren't modern standing armies with uniforms and serial numbers. They were mixtures: noble households, paid retainers, town militias, feudal levies, and hired specialists like crossbowmen, engineers, and later gunners. The tighter the personal bond to a captain or lord, the more running looked like betrayal. In later medieval England and Burgundy, many soldiers served under written service agreements and took wages through their captain. In a town militia, service could be tied to citizenship and local duty. In a feudal levy, it could be tied to obligation to a lord and the risk of losing favor or land. There's also a useful distinction between flight and desertion. Flight is what happens when a whole formation collapses and men flee together. Desertion is leaving without leave, especially before the fight or while the army is still intact. Medieval authorities cared about both, but desertion felt more personal because it looked like a deliberate breaking of faith. This mix explains why medieval rules talk so much about staying with your banner and not leaving the host, the army, in the field. Commanders weren't trying to sound heroic. They were trying to stop the one thing that could collapse a battle in minutes: men deciding, one after another, that they're on their own. The uncomfortable truth is that men ran for reasons that weren't mysterious. Fear is the obvious one, but plenty of desertion also came from hunger, sickness, long marches, lack of pay, broken equipment, or a belief that the leadership had lost control. Medieval records complain constantly about wages and supplies, and those complaints often sit right next to notes about men stealing away. So when medieval law and commanders came down hard on desertion, it wasn't only moral outrage. It was a practical attempt to keep an army from dissolving before it ever reached the enemy.
Number 2. The pressure before contact. A lot of people imagine medieval battle as an instant collision, but the buildup could drag on for hours or even days. Armies marched, camped, scouted, argued about ground, watched each other at a distance, and tried to guess who would move first. That long waiting period is where nerves got shredded, because nobody could fully see what was happening beyond the next rise or the next hedgerow. Most ordinary soldiers weren't raised from childhood with the training and social expectations that shaped knights. They were farmers, laborers, apprentices, and townsmen who might have drilled a little with local weapons, but didn't live inside a warrior lifestyle. Even experienced men could be shaken because medieval combat was close, loud, confusing, and hard to read. Dust, smoke, hills, and the sheer mass of bodies could block visibility. Orders traveled by messengers, shouted calls, horns, and drums, and those signals could be missed or misunderstood once people started moving. This is where banners mattered. A banner wasn't decoration. It was a moving landmark. It told you where your unit was, where your leaders were, and whether you were still part of something organized. If you could see your banner, you had a sense of place. If it went down or disappeared in the crowd, people could panic because they didn't know what was happening 10 or 20 meters away, let alone across the whole field. Before battle, there were also routines that added pressure in a quieter way. Prayers, confessions, last-minute speeches, checking gear, sharpening points, sharing out arrows or bolts, and listening to rumors. Men heard stories about what the enemy did to prisoners. They heard gossip about reinforcements that might or might not exist. They watched their own officers argue. All of that fed uncertainty. There's also a cold calculation that every soldier felt, even if he didn't say it out loud. A man in formation has some protection because everyone's shields, spears, and bodies make a wall. A man alone is exposed. So staying in line is often the safer choice, even if it feels terrifying. The problem is that fear doesn't show up as a neat thought. It shows up as shaking hands, nausea, tunnel vision, and the urge to move. Medieval writers describe men losing heart before a fight, and in a culture that praised courage as a virtue, that fear came with shame. Shame could hold men in place, but it could also make them snap, because once a man thinks he's already being seen as a coward, he may stop caring what happens next. That's one reason commanders treated desertion as a contagious threat, not just a personal failing. Number 3. When the line snaps. Running from battle often started with a signal that everyone could read. The fight is turning. The triggers were usually visible events, not private thoughts. A commander falls, a standard drops, a flank bends, a fresh enemy force appears, cavalry rides into a position that threatens the rear, or a rumor spreads that the baggage train is being taken, which makes men think their only way home is about to disappear. Medieval battle depended on cohesion. A shield wall, a pike block, or a line of spearmen works because people hold their ground together. Once a few men move backward without orders, gaps open. A gap means the men next to it suddenly have to face more pressure, so they step back too. That chain reaction can roll through a formation fast, and once it starts, it's hard to stop. Commanders feared this more than almost anything. A controlled withdrawal was possible, but a panicked flight was the doorway to disaster. That's why some armies placed trusted troops behind the main line, partly to steady the formation, partly to block men from bolting. That's also why commanders used simple, blunt rules like "stay with your banner" and "don't leave your captain." They didn't have radios, and they couldn't manage hundreds of small individual retreats. They needed the unit to behave like a single body. Signals mattered here too. A shout that "the Lord is dead" could be true, false, or half-true, but it could still break morale. A standard leaning or dropping could be a momentary accident, but people might read it as the unit collapsing. A sudden movement of horses behind the line could be friendly reserves or enemy riders, and in the noise, it could be impossible to tell. Equipment adds another ugly twist. When a man decides to run, his first instinct is to drop weight. Shields are left behind, pole arms get thrown away. Sometimes even helmets come off if they feel suffocating or block vision. From the runner's point of view, speed is everything. From a tactical point of view, it's a trap. Dropping your shield makes you faster, but it also makes you defenseless.
so panic creates flight. Flight creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates more deaths, and those deaths convince even more men to run. In medieval accounts, this is the moment an army breaks, and after that, the battle changes into something else.
Number 4. The rout and the chase. A huge amount of killing in medieval warfare happened after the main clash, during the rout and pursuit. That pattern shows up across pre-modern warfare, because a running army can't defend itself in an organized way. Pursuit troops, especially cavalry, were built for this phase. A mounted man can close distance quickly, strike a fleeing target from behind, and move on to the next. A foot soldier sprinting across rough ground has almost no chance in open country. Even without cavalry, a rout can destroy an army. Men run into ditches, hedges, marshes, and rivers. Narrow crossings turn into choke points. If thousands of exhausted people try to squeeze over a ford or a bridge while being chased, people get crushed or drown. That's why so many battlefields are remembered alongside nearby streams and rivers, because those features turned retreat into a bottleneck. The Battle of Towton in 1461 is often brought up for this reason. It became famous not only for the fighting, but for the pursuit across cold, wet ground, with many men trying to escape through narrow routes near small waterways like Cock Beck. The exact numbers are debated, but the mechanism is clear. Once one side collapses, the pursuit can be more lethal than the face-to-face fight. There's another reason the rout was so dangerous. Prisoners weren't equal. Knights and wealthy men were valuable alive because ransom was a business. Ordinary infantry often weren't worth guarding, feeding, and marching away under control. In the heat of pursuit, a pursuer could make a brutal, quick decision based on value and risk. That could be especially harsh in civil wars, where the enemy might be seen as a traitor, or in campaigns where raids and atrocities had built up hatred. Surviving the rout also didn't mean staying intact. Looting the defeated was normal. A man might lose boots, cloak, belt, coin, and whatever armor he still had. Without boots, a long walk becomes a crisis.
Without a cloak, a cold night becomes dangerous. So even when a runner lived, you could end up injured, stripped, and far from home. That's why "he ran away" is often the start of a second fight. A fight against exhaustion, exposure, and the simple problem of getting out of enemy territory without being caught. Number 5. Hiding and trying to disappear. If a fleeing soldier made it out of immediate pursuit, the next danger was recognition. Medieval Europe didn't have modern identity papers, but it had plenty of markers. A man might carry a lord's badge, a colored sash, or a coat cut in a military style. He might have a war bow, a spearhead, or a sword that looks like a soldier's tool. He might have the look of someone who has marched hard for days. Victorious armies sometimes sent out parties to catch stragglers and secure roads, partly to stop survivors from regrouping, partly to collect loot, and sometimes simply to remove threats. That meant the safest move for a fugitive was often to avoid obvious roads. Woods, marshes, and rough ground could hide a man from horse patrols, but they also made it harder to find food, and they slowed him down. A deserter had a few basic options, none of them comfortable. If he had money, he could try to buy civilian clothes and hide his gear. If he had friends or relatives in the region, he might beg shelter for a night and then move on before questions started. If he had nothing, he might steal, which turned him from a military offender into a criminal in civilian law as well. Foreign campaigns made everything harder. If you don't speak the local language, it's harder to buy food, ask for directions, or make up a convincing story.
And if the countryside has already been raided, locals may assume any armed stranger is there to rob them. A deserter could be attacked by locals, not out of loyalty to a king, but out of simple self-defense and fear. In places like England, the idea of sanctuary mattered too. Churches could offer temporary protection to fugitives, and some people used that to buy time. Sanctuary wasn't a guaranteed shield, especially in a chaotic war zone, and it often came with conditions. Still, it could be one of the few legal tools a desperate man could reach for when he feared immediate punishment.
Another strategy was blending into the wider wartime crowd. Medieval campaigns produced streams of people: refugees, merchants, servants, camp followers, discharged troops, and unemployed fighters looking for the next contract. A man could sometimes slip into that movement and become hard to track. If he still had a usable weapon and looked healthy, he might even try to join another unit and claim he'd been separated. Some armies ran strict musters and checked names carefully. Others cared more about filling ranks than checking a story too closely. That's one of the reasons desertion was such a headache. Medieval war created the perfect environment for people to vanish.
Number 6. Caught by your own side.
When commanders did catch men trying to slip away, punishment could be fast. Medieval military justice in the field wasn't always about careful trials. Officers had one urgent priority: keeping the army from falling apart. That's why many late medieval armies issued written rules of discipline, often called ordinances or articles of war, and why those rules could be blunt about desertion. Armies also had officials whose job was discipline. Titles vary by place and period, but you often see roles like the marshal or provost, men responsible for policing camp, running quick hearings, and carrying out sentences. This matters because it shows desertion wasn't treated as a private problem between a soldier and his captain. It was treated as an offense against the whole host. Punishments recorded in different places and periods include execution, hanging, whipping, public humiliation, and, in some cases, mutilation, like cutting off an ear or marking a man so he couldn't hide what he'd done. The point wasn't only to hurt the deserter. It was to send a message to everyone else, right when panic was most likely to spread. How harsh the punishment was depended on 3 big factors: timing, proof, and status. If a man was caught in the act of running while the fight was still undecided, commanders were more likely to react harshly because they feared a chain reaction. If a man disappeared at night and was later found weeks afterward, the army might not even have the ability to punish him, and the case might shift to local courts instead. Proof mattered too. If everyone fled, it was hard to single out the first man who broke. Status mattered as well. A noble could be politically risky to execute, and he might have friends, money, and leverage. A poor infantryman didn't. There were also punishments that hit the soldier's pocket. Loss of pay was common. Confiscation of equipment could be devastating because armor and weapons were expensive.
Denying a man his share of loot mattered too, because for many soldiers, plunder was a major part of what made campaigning worthwhile.
Commanders also used group pressure. Captains could be held responsible for missing men, and units could be denied pay until the names on the roll matched the bodies in camp. That created an internal system where comrades policed each other, because one deserter could cost everyone money. It's not a pleasant picture, but it's realistic. Medieval discipline often worked through shame, fear, and financial pressure at the same time.
Number 7. Rules, contracts, and treason.
By the later Middle Ages, desertion was often treated as more than simple disobedience. In some kingdoms running long campaigns, especially overseas wars, Leaving the host without permission could be framed as betrayal of the king's service itself. That's why some rules use language as strong as treason when they talk about soldiers abandoning their captain, leaving their post, or fleeing in battle. English kings in the Hundred Years' War era, for example, issued ordinances for armies in France that threatened death for men who left their captain or the host without permission. Other powers issued their own versions. The wording changes, but the message stays the same. Desertion is treated like a capital offense because it endangers the whole force. This wasn't just legal theater. In a medieval army, one man's decision could endanger a whole unit. If a formation breaks, the army can be destroyed in pursuit. From that angle, desertion looks like sabotage, even when the deserter is just scared or exhausted. For paid soldiers, the consequences could also be contractual. Many late medieval armies used written service contracts that spelled out wages, service length, and behavior expectations. A soldier who deserted might lose his wages, forfeit bonds, or be pursued by officials trying to recover money. In some systems, a captain had to account for every man he claimed wages for, so desertion created financial and legal trouble up the chain. Town militias had their own rules too. In a city, failing to do military duty could mean fines, loss of civic privileges, or being shut out of certain trades. In a feudal setting, refusing to serve could lead to loss of land or other penalties, because military service was tied to tenure and obligation. Enforcement was uneven, and medieval rulers were often pragmatic.
Courts were slow, evidence was messy, and a commander who needed manpower might quietly forgive a wave of absences rather than cripple his own force. After civil wars, governments sometimes issued broad pardons to stabilize the country, because trying to punish every act of disloyalty could keep conflict going for years. Still, the threat mattered. A soldier knew that if he left without permission, he might be treated as someone outside the law, outside protection, and outside the normal expectations of mercy.
Number 8. The status gap. The biggest predictor of what happened to a fleeing medieval soldier was status. Knights and nobles lived in a culture that praised honor, but they also lived in a system that protected them. A high-status fighter was valuable alive. If captured by the enemy, he could be ransomed, and there was an entire etiquette around parole, payment, and exchange. A noble might even be allowed to go free on his word to pay later, because his social position made him worth trusting in a way a common soldier wasn't. That same chivalric world could punish nobles in a different way. Reputation. A knight accused of cowardice could lose patronage, be mocked in chronicles, or find doors closed at court. In some cases, public humiliation mattered more than a physical sentence, because his whole identity was built on honor. Common soldiers didn't have that safety net. A hired spearman or a levy infantryman had little ransom value. If he was caught after running, he could be treated as disposable. That's one reason medieval sources sometimes treat noble cowardice as scandal and common cowardice as crime. The noble's reputation mattered in politics. The common soldier's life mattered less in the calculations of power. Mobility also split outcomes. Mounted men could withdraw faster, which meant they were more likely to survive a defeat than the foot troops they led. That could create bitterness. When foot soldiers saw leaders ride away while they had to run on tired legs over bad ground, trust could collapse fast. Then there's the professional soldier layer. By the late Middle Ages, many armies relied on paid troops who fought for wages. These men could be disciplined and effective,
but their loyalty was often tied to regular pay and supply. When wages stopped, desertion could spike, and commanders knew it. Some mercenary companies enforced their own strict rules because their reputation mattered for future contracts.
So a deserter might face punishment not only from a king's officers, but also from his own comrades. Even within common soldiers, there were levels of value. A skilled archer, an experienced crossbowman, or a trained gunner could be hard to replace. A commander might punish him less harshly, or try to pull him back into service because the army needed his skill. An untrained levy was easier to sacrifice, as an example. Status didn't decide whether fear existed. It decided what kind of consequences were likely to follow.
Number 9. Reputation and social fallout. Even when a deserter escaped formal punishment, he still had to live among people who watched and remembered. Medieval communities were close-knit. Neighbors recognized faces, family names, and stories. If a man came home from a battle that his town or village took part in, people noticed. If he came home early or without his gear, or with a story that didn't match anyone else's, rumors spread quickly. Being known as a coward could shut doors in practical ways. Employers might not hire him. A guild might refuse him. Neighbors might not support him in disputes. And in communities where people depended on each other for labor and protection, that support mattered. In legal traditions influenced by Roman and church law, certain kinds of dishonor could make a person infamous in a technical sense, limiting the roles he could play as a witness or a trusted representative. Even where the law didn't use that label, reputation still worked like a slow punishment. Family reputation mattered too. One person's disgrace could stain a household. That could affect marriages, business ties, and local alliances. Some families protected themselves by distancing from the deserter, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly. That left the deserter with fewer options: stay and accept a life under suspicion, or leave and start over somewhere else. Starting over was easier said than done. A man who leaves his community loses the safety net that makes medieval life possible: shared labor, credit, and local protection. So some deserters drifted into work that required fewer references: seasonal labor, guarding, river transport, or service under a new patron who didn't ask too many questions. Others ended up in outlaw bands or violent freelancing, not because that was a dream, but because ordinary society had blocked their return. Different regions had their own language for dishonor. In Scandinavian and North Atlantic traditions, being branded a man without honor could be socially crushing, even when it didn't show up as a formal court sentence. In late medieval towns, the same idea could appear as being treated as not trustworthy, which is a quiet phrase with very sharp consequences. Public memory could be harsh in another way. Noble failures could be written down by chroniclers and repeated for generations. Common soldiers rarely got named, but they also rarely got defended. The label of cowardice didn't land evenly across society, yet for the individuals involved, it could be life-shaping. Number 10. Guilt, faith, and life afterward. For many medieval soldiers, leaving the field wasn't only a legal problem or a social one. It could feel like a spiritual wound. Oaths mattered. A vow to a lord, a promise to a captain, or even a spoken commitment made in a religious setting carried weight because it was understood as being made before God. Breaking that vow could be treated as serious sin, especially if it was seen as perjury or betrayal of rightful authority. That meant a deserter could carry guilt long after he was physically safe. Confession and penance offered a path back in theory, but in practice, it depended on local conditions and the willingness of a community to accept the man again. Some deserters tried to repair their standing through public repentance, donations, pilgrimages, or later service, but none of those guaranteed that neighbors would forget. In a world where salvation, shame, and daily life were tightly connected, spiritual fear and social fear could feed each other. Alongside guilt was the mental impact of battle and flight. Medieval writers didn't use modern medical labels, but they described men who came back changed, shaking, sleepless, withdrawn, jumpy at sudden sounds, or unable to handle weapons the way they used to. A man who ran might replay the moment again and again, especially if he believed his flight opened a gap that got other people hurt. Even men who were never punished in court could still be punished by memory. Then there's the long paperwork tale of late medieval war. As governments became more bureaucratic, they created more lists, musters, wage accounts, court records, pardon letters. A man who resurfaced years later might seek an official pardon after a civil conflict because politics sometimes demanded forgiveness in bulk. Others simply tried to stay out of sight. A clerk's note that a man was absent or gone could follow him into later disputes about pay or service, and that could drag the past back into the present. Sometimes the story ends in a document rather than a dramatic moment. A petition that explains why a man fled, a pardon that clears him on paper, or a local record that says he forfeited wages and equipment for leaving without leave. Wax seals and signatures don't erase what happened on the field, but they could decide whether the next officer who recognizes his name treats him as a free man or as someone who still owes a penalty.